On a cold and rainy evening in New York, Nathaniel Brooks, a 30-year-old millionaire CEO with striking blue eyes that often intimidated boardrooms but now reflected the quiet ache of loneliness, sat behind the wheel of his luxury black sedan, his sharp blue tailored suit pressed against the leather seat as droplets from the storm streaked across his windshield, and though the city lights shimmered in the puddles on the road, nothing caught his attention until a faint movement at the corner of the street pulled his gaze away from his phone. And there, framed beneath a flickering street lamp, stood two tiny figures no taller than his car door, twin little girls no older than 5, their golden hair clinging to their foreheads, their dresses soaked through and sticking to their fragile bodies, their arms trembling as the cold drizzle soaked them to the bone. Yet in their tiny hands they clutched a wicker basket half covered with a damp cloth, and from that basket the faint aroma of cookies drifted through the rain, though the sweetness of the scent contrasted painfully with the sorrow etched across their innocent faces. For they weren't laughing, they weren't playing, they weren't like other children who should have been safe in warm homes at this hour. Instead they stood on the roadside, their lips trembling as they whispered to every passer-by who ignored them, "Please, sir, buy one for our mommy." Words so soft they nearly dissolved in the storm, but somehow they cut through the hum of Nathaniel's engine and the honking of distant traffic like a knife, and his chest tightened as he rolled down his window, rain blowing in and spotting his suit jacket. Yet he didn't care because his eyes locked on theirs, and in those two pairs of bright blue eyes he saw fear, he saw hunger, he saw a kind of desperation that no child should ever know. And as he studied the trembling hands, holding out a cookie wrapped in a napkin already damp from the rain, he felt a surge of something he had not felt in years, compassion, raw and unfiltered, crashing into him like a forgotten memory. And though the stoplight glared red above him and impatient drivers behind him pressed their horns, Nathaniel sat frozen, captivated, his throat tight, because he couldn't look away from the heartbreaking sight of innocence colliding with survival. And as one of the little girls tried to smile despite her teeth chattering, whispering again, "Please, sir, just one cookie for our mommy," Nathaniel felt his pulse hammer in his ears, his palms tightening on the wheel, because a single question rose louder than the rain, heavier than the city noise, more urgent than any business deal he had ever closed. What kind of world leaves two fragile children alone on a stormy night, selling cookies in the dark, just to save their mother's life? Nathaniel slowly lowered the window, the hum of the motor blending with the sound of rain splashing against the asphalt. And as the glass slid down, the chill of the night air rushed in, carrying the faint smell of wet pavement mixed with the sugary scent of cookies barely protected under the cloth in the little basket. And when his eyes met the twins' faces up close, his breath caught, because Lily and Grace were not just children selling sweets, they were two fragile souls fighting a battle far too heavy for their tiny shoulders, their innocent, tear-filled eyes shimmering in the dim glow of the streetlight as if holding entire oceans of unspoken pain, their worn-out clothes clinging to their damp skin, the hems frayed and stained from kneeling on sidewalks that never cared for their presence. Yet even as raindrops streaked down their cheeks, they tried to smile bravely, as if smiling could hide the trembling in their lips or the raw fear in our hearts. And Nathaniel, a man who had built empires with steel nerves and ruthless decisions, felt an unfamiliar lump rise in his throat, his voice gentler than it had been in years when he finally asked, "Where is your mother?" And the silence that followed stretched into eternity until Lily, the slightly taller of the two, lifted her chin though it quivered, and in a shaky voice that cracked with every syllable, whispered words that pierced him deeper than any insult, deeper than any loss, deeper than any business betrayal he had ever endured. "She's in the hospital. Doctor said she needs surgery. We are trying to help." And the way she said trying, as though a 5-year-old child could shoulder the burden of hospital bills, surgeries, and adult despair, made his chest tighten painfully. And before he could react, Grace clutched the basket tighter and added softly, "Mommy says we can't give up." Her tiny fingers white with cold as she held the basket steady, offering him a cookie, not as a product, not as a transaction, but as a desperate bridge between survival and hopelessness. And Nathaniel's vision blurred as rain dripped from his lashes, though he knew it wasn't all rain, because something raw was stirring inside him, something he had buried beneath luxury cars, skyscraper offices, and billion-dollar contracts, A memory of nights he spent alone, hungry, abandoned, a memory of his own mother's tired smile before sickness stole her breath. And in the twins' bravery, he saw not weakness, but strength. A strength so pure it shamed the world around them. A strength that made strangers hurry past with umbrellas held high, because no one wanted to face the truth that these children were living mirrors of society's failure. And as the red light glowed above him and impatient horns blared behind, Nathaniel sat frozen, his heartbeat thundering in his chest, because logic told him 2 little girls selling cookies could never earn enough for a life-saving surgery. But his soul whispered another question entirely. Could he walk away knowing they were out here alone in the rain? Fighting a battle no child should fight, clinging to dignity their mother had instilled in them, and if he left, could he ever forgive himself? Nathaniel's heart pounded against his chest so violently it almost drowned out the sound of the storm, and as the little girl's trembling voice echoed in his ears, it pulled him backward in time, ripping open memories he had spent years burying beneath boardroom victories and gleaming skyscrapers. Memories of a small, cramped apartment where a frail woman with the same blue eyes as his had once smiled at him through her exhaustion, his mother, the only anchor of love he had known, a woman whose laughter had been soft but whose strength had been unshakable, until illness came like a thief in the night, stealing her breath, her strength, her life. And Nathaniel remembered the nights he sat at her bedside clutching her fragile hand, while doctors whispered outside the door about costs his family could never afford. The crushing humiliation of watching his mother fade because money, something he would one day possess in obscene abundance, was absent when it mattered most. And now, staring at these 2 fragile girls standing in the rain with a basket of cookies, he saw more than strangers. He saw himself, reflected in their eyes, in their desperation, in their brave attempt to hold on when the world offered nothing but indifference. And it was as if fate itself had placed them here, reminding him of the vow he had once made as a boy, whispering to his mother's grave that he would become rich, powerful, untouchable, so he would never again feel the helplessness of watching someone he loved slip away. And now the vow burned in his chest, because this time, he told himself, I won't let history repeat itself, not while I have the power to change it, not while these girls are standing in front of me fighting the very same battle I lost. Yet before the words could leave his lips, before his hand could reach out to them, the blaring horns of cars behind him shattered the fragile moment, impatient drivers yelling through half-open windows, their voices filled with annoyance instead of compassion, and the twins, startled, quickly stepped back from the curb, their small feet splashing in puddles as they hurried away, clutching their basket as though even that meager symbol of hope could be snatched from them, their eyes darting nervously as if they had done something wrong simply by existing, by daring to ask for help. And Nathaniel's knuckles whitened around the steering wheel, every instinct in him screaming to get out, to run after them, to tell them they were not a disturbance but a reminder of everything human. Yet years of practiced detachment warred with the storm inside him, his mind whispering that he should just drive away, continue his night, return to the comfort of his penthouse. But his heart, for the first time in years, demanded something different, demanded he listen not to logic or pride, but to the ache of memory and the call of conscience. And as the light turned green and traffic surged forward, Nathaniel sat frozen, his soul caught between 2 paths, the easy one that would let him escape, and the harder one that could change everything. And in that split second, he knew his choice would define far more than this night. It would define the man he truly was. Nathaniel's hands trembled slightly as he pulled his car to the side of the road, the wipers dragging across the windshield in a steady rhythm, as if counting down the seconds of a decision that could change everything. And when he stepped out, the cold rain instantly soaked his suit, plastering his black hair against his forehead, but he barely noticed because his eyes stayed locked on the 2 little figures ahead, their fragile bodies dwarfed by the rushing crowd of strangers who streamed past them without a glance, some shaking their heads in irritation, others muttering words of annoyance, and even a few mocking, with cruel laughter, as though the sight of 2 desperate children trying to sell cookies in the storm was something amusing instead of heartbreaking. And Nathaniel's chest tightened with anger, his polished shoes splashing in puddles as he reached them, their small basket now nearly empty, the last few cookies soggy from the rain. And without hesitation he knelt down, his powerful presence suddenly on the same level as theirs, and said softly, "I'll take them all." Reaching for his wallet, pulling out a thick stack of bills without even thinking, but before the notes could touch their hands, Lily, with her golden hair sticking to her cheeks and her blue eyes wide but steady, pushed his hand back with surprising firmness for someone so tiny, her small fingers trembling not from fear but from determination, and she whispered words that cut through him sharper than any business rival's insult, words that cracked the armor he had built around his heart. "We don't want charity, sir," Mommy said. "We must earn with dignity." And for a moment Nathaniel could only stare at her, stunned, because dignity was a word he hadn't heard spoken with such conviction even in boardrooms filled with men twice his age, and here it was, carried on the fragile voice of a 5-year-old child who refused to bend under pity, who insisted her worth was tied not to someone's mercy, but to the strength of her own hands, and as Grace nodded beside her, clutching the basket to her chest like a treasure, Nathaniel felt the weight of their innocence, their pride, their resilience crash over him, and a whisper escaped his lips without thought. Dignity, even at 5 years old. His voice breaking as he realized these children had been raised by a mother who had given them not wealth, not comfort, but something far greater, an unshakable core of honor and strength, and Nathaniel's mind swirled with question. Is that pierced deeper with every heartbeat? What kind of mother teaches her daughters to value dignity over survival? Who instills pride so strong it outshines fear? Who gives them courage so unyielding it shames the indifference of the adults who walk past without care? And as the rain poured harder and the girls stood firm, refusing the easy path of pity, Nathaniel's soul whispered the truth. This was not ordinary strength. This was the kind of strength born from sacrifice, from love, from a woman who had chosen to teach her children how to stand tall even when the world forced them to their knees. And in that realization, Nathaniel felt something shift inside him, because these girls were not just asking him to buy cookies, they were asking him to see them, to respect them, to honor the lesson their mother had carved into their hearts, and in that moment, Nathaniel knew he could not simply walk away, because the question echoing in his mind was no longer whether he should help, but rather, who was the woman powerful enough to raise daughters like this? The little girls held tightly to Nathaniel's hands as they guided him through the dark, rain-slick streets toward a small public hospital, their tiny feet splashing through puddles, their soaked dresses clinging to their frail frames, and though Nathaniel could have easily carried them both in his arms, he allowed them to lead, sensing that in their minds they were not children tonight, but warriors fighting to save the only person who mattered. And when they finally pushed open the worn glass doors of the hospital, a wave of sterile air mixed with the scent of disinfectant and despair washed over him, the dimly lit corridors filled with exhausted faces of patients waiting on hard benches, the peeling paint on the walls a testament to years of neglect, and Nathaniel, a man accustomed to pristine private clinics with polished marble floors, felt his chest tighten as he realized this place was held together not by money, but by desperate hope. And when Lily tugged his sleeve and whispered, "This way," he followed, until they reached the emergency ward, where on a narrow bed under flickering fluorescent lights lay a woman pale as paper, her breathing shallow, her lips drained of color, tubes running from her fragile arms into machines that beeped with a haunting rhythm. And though unconscious, there was an undeniable strength in her features, the kind that told Nathaniel this was no ordinary woman. This was a mother who had given every drop of herself for her children, until her body could give no more, and before he could even process the sight, a weary doctor stepped forward, adjusting his glasses as he spoke in a tone that carried more resignation than hope. "She needs critical surgery tonight, but without advance payment, we cannot proceed." And those words struck Nathaniel like a hammer, ripping open the wound of his past, reminding him of the exact sentence he once heard whispered outside his mother's room, the same cruel barrier between life and death measured not in skill or medicine, but in cold currency, and as his vision blurred, he felt the tug of two small hands gripping his tightly. Lily on one side, Grace on the other, their voices trembling, yet filled with desperate faith as they whispered, "Please save our mommy." Their tiny fingers clutching his with such force it was as though they believed he alone held the power between life and death, and Nathaniel, the man who had built an empire on logic, suddenly found logic meaningless. His throat tightening as hot tears welled in his eyes for the first time in years, because standing there in that cold ward, surrounded by flickering lights and the sound of rain pounding on the hospital windows, he realized this moment was no coincidence. This was fate handing him the chance to rewrite the ending he once lived through, and as the girls pressed closer, their innocent pleas echoing in his ears, Nathaniel's heart cracked open. And because he knew without doubt that walking away was impossible, for this was not just about Amelia Carter, a stranger on a hospital bed, this was about every part of himself he had buried, every regret he had carried, and the chance to finally save the mother he could not save all those years ago, through the life of another. Nathaniel didn't think twice before reaching into his wallet, his hand trembling as he paid for everything the doctor demanded, his signature scrawled with urgency on the hospital documents, as if each stroke was fueled by something far beyond duty. It was personal, it was raw, it was the kind of decision born from scars buried deep in his past, and as the nurses rushed Amelia into the operating theater, Nathaniel found himself sitting in the cold waiting area, surrounded by the sterile smell of antiseptic and the muffled footsteps of people moving with practiced indifference, and that was when fragments of Amelia's story began to reach him through the quiet whispers of the hospital staff and the hesitant words of the twins, piecing together a life that felt like a testament to endurance. She had once been a brilliant baker, a woman whose pastries had filled a small shop with the smell of fresh bread and joy, whose hands, flour-stained and strong, kneaded not just dough but dreams, until life betrayed her when the man she trusted most walked away, leaving her not with love but with responsibility, not with comfort but with twin daughters who looked to her as both mother and father, and instead of collapsing under the weight of abandonment, Amelia fought. She worked tirelessly, balancing jobs that drained her body while still finding time to smile at her daughters, instilling in them lessons of dignity, kindness, and strength. And when her shop was forced to close, she didn't bow her head in shame, but began baking at night, selling cookies through the tiny hands of her daughters during the day, turning survival into a legacy of honor. And Nathaniel, listening, watching, absorbing, felt a piercing ache twist in his chest because every word of her journey mirrored something inside him, mirrored the years he spent haunted by the ghost of his own mother who had wasted away under illness while his powerless younger self had been forced to watch. And in Amelia's resilience, he saw not just a woman but a reflection of everything he once wished his mother could have been given. A chance, a second lifeline, a supporter who refused to let her dignity be stolen by hardship, and he realized with a kind of trembling awe that the twins' defiant words about earning with honor didn't come from innocence but from a mother who had carved strength into their souls, who despite her frailty in the hospital bed, had already won a war against despair by passing on courage to her children. And Nathaniel's admiration deepened into something more dangerous than respect, something he couldn't quite name but could feel tightening around his heart, whispering that this wasn't coincidence, that his meeting this family wasn't some passing act of charity, that fate was demanding he step into their story, because as he sat there with the twins gripping his hand as though he were their anchor, he felt the fragile thread between his past and their present weaving together into a connection he couldn't explain but couldn't deny. A connection that frightened him as much as it moved him, because for the first time in years he wasn't just Nathaniel the CEO, he was Nathaniel the son, Nathaniel the boy who had lost, and Nathaniel the man who now, perhaps, had a chance to rewrite what had once been stolen from him. The hallway lights flickered softly as the long night of waiting finally came to an end. Nathaniel pacing with restless hands folded behind his back, the twins clinging to each other on the bench, their tiny eyes heavy but unwilling to close, until at last the operating room door creaked open and the doctor stepped out, his expression carrying the weight of hope, and with a calm smile he said the words that lifted the crushing weight from the air, "She will survive," and in that single sentence the tension dissolved. The twin squealed with joy and rushed forward, their little arms wrapping tightly around Nathaniel's legs as if he were their anchor in a storm, their innocent voices echoing, "Thank you, sir. You saved Mommy." And Nathaniel bent down, feeling the warmth of their embrace melt the cold walls he had built around his heart for years. But before he could respond, the sound of footsteps emerged from inside the ward, the gentle rustle of sheets and the faint moan of someone waking, and when Amelia's frail eyes fluttered open, searching through the haze of pain and medicine, they landed on Nathaniel, and instantly, a strange silence fell. her lips trembling as if touched by a memory too deep to bury, and with a weak, cracked voice she whispered, "Why, are you here?" And those words froze Nathaniel, slicing through his soul like a knife, for in that instant his mind was hurled backward in time, back to the nights when he was just a desperate, hungry college boy with no roof over his head, the nights he wandered streets in shame and defeat, until one woman with kind eyes and flour-stained hands opened her door, gave him bread from her bakery, offered him a small room in the back, and whispered encouragement when the world seemed determined to crush him. And now, standing before her hospital bed, Nathaniel's breath caught as recognition struck like lightning, because Amelia Carter, the mother fighting for life, the woman whose daughters had captured his heart, was that very same woman, the one who had once saved him when he was nothing, and now fate had twisted their lives into a circle, binding them once again, but this time with her daughter's innocent eyes watching, and with Nathaniel's heart pounding louder than it ever had before. He could only stare, torn between gratitude, disbelief, and an emotion so raw it left him trembling, because the woman he had rushed to save was the very woman who once saved him. Nathaniel fell to his knees beside Amelia's fragile hospital bed, his trembling hands gripping the cold metal rail as if anchoring himself to the truth unraveling before his eyes, his voice breaking as he whispered, "You gave me kindness when I was lost, and today fate brought me back to return it." And in that moment the room seemed to still, the ticking clock above fading into silence as Amelia's eyes, weak yet glistening with recognition, overflowed with tears that mirrored years of unspoken pain, sacrifice, and resilience, her lips quivering as though she had carried this memory through sleepless nights and endless struggles only to see it bloom again when all hope had nearly withered away, and the twins, their tiny arms trembling, pressed themselves against their mother, their little hearts beating fast with the relief of her survival, before their innocent gazes turned to Nathaniel, their voices breaking in childlike vulnerability as they whispered together, "Does this mean you're our guardian angel now?" And the words pierced through Nathaniel's soul like sunlight breaking through storm clouds, shattering the last walls of loneliness that had bound his heart for years, making his tears fall freely, unashamed as he forced a trembling smile and replied, "No, little angels, you are mine." Words so raw and honest that Amelia gasped softly, as if the chains of abandonment, betrayal, and despair she had carried alone finally cracked open, replaced by the sudden, overwhelming certainty that she was no longer alone in this fight. And Nathaniel, with eyes burning with both regret and newfound purpose, vowed not only to cover every cost of her treatment, but to lift her beyond the bed of survival, declaring in his heart that he would breathe life back into her broken dreams, that the bakery she once built with flour-dusted hands and a hope-filled heart would rise again, stronger than before, a sanctuary of dignity rather than struggle, a beacon of her strength rather than her pain. And as he imagined her laughter returning to its rightful place behind a counter filled with the warmth of fresh bread and the sweetness of cookies crafted with love, his chest tightened with a joy he had not known since his own days of hunger and despair, remembering vividly the night she had opened her door to a desperate boy, hungry and aimless, offering him bread, shelter, and dignity without asking for anything in return, the night that had planted a seed of hope in him that had grown into the man he was today, and now that seed had come full circle, blooming into a vow that her sacrifice would never be forgotten, that her children would never know hunger, and that her name, Amelia Carter, would forever be linked not to sorrow but to strength, to triumph, to a kindness that built bridges between broken souls. And as the twins pressed their cheeks against their mother's chest, Nathaniel gently placed his hand atop theirs, feeling a bond forming thicker than blood, a bond born not of chance, but of destiny. And Amelia, still weak but no longer weighed down by despair, whispered through her tears, "Kindness always comes back," her words trembling yet firm, as if passing a final truth to her daughters. And Nathaniel, overwhelmed, nodded through the flood of his emotions, knowing she was right, that life had brought them back to this very place, not to reopen old wounds, but to prove that love, humanity, and care could conquer pain, rebuild dignity, and rewrite futures. And as dawn's first light filtered through the hospital window, illuminating Amelia's face with a golden glow, Nathaniel knew this was not the end but the beginning, of healing, of rebuilding, of a family bound not by blood but by something far greater, kindness repaid, love discovered, and dignity restored, a circle complete, a story eternal.